Why do most nations have a negative opinion of Israel? To preface this, the Arab-Israeli conflict is the most complicated political issue in the world. It's been the most complicated political issue in the world since the breakup of the Soviet Union. You will find that a reasonably complete answer to your question will not fit into a few paragraphs. Maybe you'll get a reasonably complete answer in a textbook, but I'm not going to write a textbook for you. Id J-Kappa. In the beginning there was the kingdom of Judah. We're talking 1000 BC, 500 BC here. Longest time ago. Anyway, it was ruled by Jews, supposedly beginning with David. It's what one would read about in the Old Testament if one is into that sort of thing. I won't get into it, but the short version of what the Torah will have you believe is that God gives Jews the Holy Land. Then the kingdom of Judah gets conquered by the Persians and then by the Romans. All the stuff one might read about in the New Testament happens in the Roman Empire during this time. The Romans called this chunk of land Palestine. The short version is that Jesus, King of the Jews, does a bunch of stuff in Jerusalem, and now Jerusalem is both the Holy Land of both the Jews and the Christians. A few hundred years go by, the Roman Empire breaks up, and now the Byzantine Empire, aka the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Roman Empire, which is what they called themselves more or less, they viewed the breakup of the empire as being a minor territorial dispute, now rules over areas including Jerusalem. Oh, and by the way, they're Christian now instead of Roman mythology. Which is too bad, because those stories are way more interesting than the holy books of the Abrahamic religions. Yes, it's important that I give a rundown of most of Western history. I told you it's complicated. Does this break Rule 4 for commenting? Maybe? Certainly your question can't be answered without giving the background. Anyway, Muhammad takes over the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Not Jerusalem though. During his life, he experiences a one-night journey where he visits the farthest mosque. I'm paraphrasing here, and Muslims aren't supposed to paraphrase Muhammad, but I'm not Muslim so I don't care. Google Isra Miraj. Islamic scholars are in broad agreement that the farthest mosque is Jerusalem, even if such agreement is on somewhat shaky theological foundations. Most notably, there weren't any Muslims in Jerusalem, let alone Muhammad, so there's that. But it doesn't matter, now Jerusalem is Islam's holy land too. After Muhammad died, the government he created didn't die with him. Nor the religion, of course. At this point, the government and the religion is kind of the same thing and takes over a lot of land, including Jerusalem. A few hundred years later, the Pope decides this will not stand and begins the Crusades. The Crusades are their own complicated topic, but all you need to know is that from the Islamic perspective, were peak Catholic assholery. Although there were a few individuals who really cared about recapturing the Holy Land, but mostly it was about looting and pillaging. They sacked, looted, and pillaged Constantinople, which was Catholic at that point. It was a shit show. You didn't want to live in Constantinople at that point. They also looted and pillaged everything else they came across too, but the point is, they sacked, looted, and pillaged Constantinople, which was the Catholic Byzantine Empire's capital. Which left the Byzantine Empire open to being conquered by the Muslims. Which it was. Despite the fact that the Crusaders basically gave the Muslims Constantinople and the rest of modern-day Turkey, they were still really salty about getting looted, raped, and pillaged for 200-odd years. This was pretty much the status quo for several hundred years with regards to Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire took over, and there were squabbles about land in other places, notably Spain and Eastern Europe, but all was pretty quiet in Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire had plenty of border squabbles, but for the most part, they were pretty good about letting local ethnic communities take care of their own shit. If there were towns, villages, or communities within larger cities of Jews or Christians or Coptics or whatever living wherever, even in Jerusalem, and they kept order and paid their taxes, the Ottomans left them alone. Meanwhile, the Jews were having a pretty shitty time in the West, including Europe and Russia. I'm finally starting to get to the point. Think Jim Crow but different. Systematic, institutionalized prejudice prevented them from owning land or voting, etc. A lot of Jews were talking about making their own nation-state comprised entirely of Jews. Not a whole lot of traction was gained though. Things were bad, but they weren't that bad. Still, the voices were loud. This philosophy was and still is called Zionism, the establishment of a nation-state of Jews, ideally located in the Jewish Holy Land, Israel. Which hadn't been a thing for 2,000 years. World War I happens. The Ottoman Empire sides with the Central Powers. aka the losing side, the Ottoman Empire is overrun during the course of the war, the country is broken up and parceled out. Go watch Lawrence of Arabia. Jerusalem becomes part of the British Empire. Some Muslims view this as a continuation of the Crusades. The rest of the Central Powers are instituted with limp dick governments and a mandate to repay tremendous sums of money to the victors. Germany ends up an economic shitshow. Hyperinflation happens, basically everything turns to shit. Adolf Hitler rose to power, blames the Jews, pogroms and stuff happens. World War II happens, the Holocaust, etc. Hitler is eventually defeated. The US is still fighting Japan for another year, France becomes a country again and is dealing with their own problems, and Britain and Russia are mostly cleaning up Hitler's mess. The Jews, for the most part, are like fuck this shit, I'm out. But where do you go? Well, they've been hearing crazy Uncle Avi rant about wanting to move to Israel for about 5 decades. And they want to go fucking anywhere, and guess what? Britain is like, fine, you can go to Israel since they owned it and didn't want to be accused of mistreating Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So lots of Jews move to Israel. Here's the thing about the Jews going to Israel, it isn't just a migration, it's a cultural movement. Hebrew, a dead language for 2,000 years, is resurrected and becomes an unofficial language. The Jews form their own government system with de facto local leaders, although no official authority or sovereignty, and petition the British government to become their own countries. Their Arab neighbors, with their own de facto leaders without official authority, view this as kind of a joke, because they've been making the same arguments, even to the point of armed insurrection, since the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, which again, they view as a continuation of the Crusades, with Christians coming in and looting and pillaging. Britain can't deal with trying to put down a Jewish rebellion, both because of the PR thing, what with the Holocaust and all that, and because they have to rebuild their own country and because the Korean War is happening. Britain's internal politics are a shit show, and Britain's superpower status is wavering hard. So Britain gives the Israeli authorities sovereignty. And the Arab authorities lose their shit. Civil war starts. The short version is that Israel wins and effectively controls most of the land. So now it's 1950 and Israel has become its own real country effectively out of nowhere in about 3 years. There are a handful of Arabs who live there, but for the most part, they're outnumbered in Israel by a significant margin, and the displaced people in the refugee camps never really had any real assets to begin with. Israel has an open immigration policy for Jews, and they experience significant immigration over the coming decades. In 1956, Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Google Suez Crisis, this angered Britain and France. Britain and France talk Israel into invading Egypt in exchange for aid. From a military standpoint, this succeeds, but it's a political shitshow. There's widespread outrage in the British public for starting another fucking war. The US is pissed because it jeopardized anti-communist agendas in other places. Egypt was ostensibly a relatively friendly state to the US, basically it goes poorly. Britain is oil-strapped because of the loss of the Suez Canal. Britain goes to the IMF for help, the US shuts them down, Saudi Arabia embargoes Britain for oil, and the US supports them. Britain, France, and Israel pull out. But the damage is already done. Israel isn't just a stain on the map, Israel is now actively a threat to the sovereignty of Egypt in their mind. Tensions are high. Israel is in a bad economic and political position, they don't have aid from anyone, they can't buy weapons from any country except France, and France has shitty weapons. The remaining Arabs in Israeli-controlled lands aren't doing so well, they can't go to other Arab countries because those countries aren't accepting refugees, it's a shit show. Meanwhile, Israel is building settlements in lands inhabited by Arabs for the massive influx of Jews who want their own Jewish homeland. Part 2. 1967 rolls around, and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon combine forces to invade Israel. Israel sees this coming and launches a preemptive attack. Miraculously, despite being heavily outmanned and outgunned, or maybe because the Arab forces are orchestrating a shitshow, Israel pulls it together and holds fast. And launch a counterattack in which they actually gain land. This war was called the Six-Day War. It lasted 6 days. A lot of land, actually, they capture the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights in Syria, as mentioned by another poster. Things are pretty bad for the Arab forces and a ceasefire is called, with both sides ending the conflict with the land they controlled at some arbitrary point on the 6th day, despite the fact that the conflict continued for an additional few days. Elite. It lasted more than 6 days. At this point, the US starts to realize Israel could be a valuable ally. The US starts giving large sums of money and, more importantly, access to current US weapon technology. Israel goes from flying shitty French planes and driving World War II-era US tanks to the latest and greatest the US military-industrial complex has to offer. Anyway, Egypt, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and Egypt are pissed about all of this. Especially Egypt. They lost control of the Sinai Peninsula, and that's threatening their control of the Suez Canal, which is a really important asset. 6 years later, they all gather together to invade Israel again. In 1973, they're poised to invade Israel. This time, Israel doesn't see it coming and are blindsided by a surprise invasion. Google Yom Kippur War anyway. This is a much tougher fight for Israel because Egypt, Syria, and Jordan have the latest and greatest in terms of Soviet SAMs, and Israel doesn't have complete air superiority the way they did in 1967. The war was a shitshow on both sides. A ceasefire is eventually called without significant changes, except now people hate each other more. Anyway, a few years go by and Egypt is sick of this shit. Their leader, effectively a dictator at this point, wants some sort of normalization. Jimmy Carter brings Israel and Egypt to the bargaining table, and Israel gives up the Sinai Peninsula for a lasting peace between Egypt and Israel. Which is nice. But this didn't help the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip or the other territories the Arabs live in the land Israel still controlled. Those places were still a shitshow. There was no standard of living. Other nearby nations didn't accept them as refugees. It was a huge humanitarian crisis. Still is. Israel was still expanding in population and was, and still is, continuing to build settlements in lands where lots of Arabs live. Even if it meant bulldozing refugee camps. Which they did. The whole bulldozing refugee camps thing is a big part of the answer to your question. Anyway, with the loss of Egypt as an ally in any potential future wars, Jordan kind of gives up trying to affect the status quo, which just leaves Syria and Lebanon being foreign nations trying to aggress on Israel. But they're not strong enough, militarily, to do anything without Egypt's help. There's a conflict with Lebanon in 1982, which was a shitshow, but other than that, it's just been failed attempts at further peace treaties. Which leaves the Palestinians, who are like, WTF mate? After Lebanon in 1982, they realized they're pretty much on their own. So they've taken to fighting an insurgency. Suicide bombers in markets, blindly firing rockets into Israeli cities, guerrilla warfare, etc. Which is an issue for Israel. They can't fight this war. They can fight wars against armies incredibly well, but they can't fight against a guy dressed as a janitor wearing a dynamic vest walking into a school with a mop and a bucket full of dynamite. But they've taken to fighting back asymmetrically too. Somebody blows up a school, Israel bulldozes a refugee camp. Somebody lobs a rocket into a densely populated civilian sector, they build another settlement. Clinton tried to get Camp Davis Accords version 2.0 going between Israel and Yasser Arafat, but those pretty much fell through. Yasser Arafat refused to condemn suicide bombings and random rocket attacks. So those kept happening. And Israel never stopped retaliating. It was a shitshow. So Israel kind of stopped caring. They abandoned hope of a diplomatic solution and have embraced a final solution. Evict the Arabs from any and all territories they can, accept the fact that they will live the remainder of the existence of humanity living under hyper-TSA on steroids, and that sometimes a suicide bomber will get through and blow some of them up. They've given up the hope of peace for a perpetual future of hypervigilance and pseudo-security. And most nations have negative opinions of them for that. TLDR, it's a shitshow. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured significant territories from the surrounding countries. Those areas contain mainly Palestinians, nearly 2 million of them, and they have basically been in limbo ever since. Israel does not really want these people to be citizens because they want to remain a country of mostly Jews. The Palestinians, mostly, do not want to be Israeli citizens because they feel it's their own land and also don't really like Jews. For most neutral outside observers, the obvious solution is to make a new country for the Palestinians out of the captured territories. This is called the two-state solution. For decades, world leaders have been trying to get everyone to agree on the details and make it happen. However, it has become obvious that Israel has no intention of ever accepting the two-state solution. Israeli leaders tell the international community that they are willing to negotiate, but domestically claim they will never cede territory. They move more and more Jewish settlers into the disputed areas every year, making a future division harder and harder. The situation in Israel is starting to look like apartheid, with Palestinians being de facto Israeli citizens but forming an underclass with restricted rights. The more Israel works to make that situation permanent, the more condemnation they get from the international community.